Welcome. Welcome to our August archaeology lecture featuring Dr. Brooke Bauer. The Office of State Archaeology hosts speakers each month to present research on archaeological research or related fields conducted in the state and around the region. All lectures are free and open to the public, and we're glad that you. If you are watching online, feel free to catch us when it's posted online afterwards on the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources Department's YouTube channel. It's now my honor to introduce Dr. Brooke Bauer. She is an assistant professor in the History and Native American Studies Department at the University of South Carolina in Lancaster, and she is an enrolled citizen of the Catawba Indian Nation of South Carolina. Her fields of specialization include Native American Studies, U.S. History, American Women's History, and Native North American Material Culture. And she has worked closely with archaeologists, including myself, to facilitate archaeological research. She received her BA and MA degrees at Winthrop University and her PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 2016. She has published 2 book chapters and several book reviews. And she's currently working on a manuscript that analyzes becoming and being Catawba. Today, Brooke Bauer will present her paper entitled A World of Transformation, The Lives of Catawba Women from 1746 to 1840. Please welcome Brooke Bauer.
Tanaki, Niat Brooke Bauer, Niaya Iswahere, Ureri Utsore, Demonson Hanaturi. So I said, hello, my name is Brooke Bauer. I am Catawba and I'm a historian, so we don't really have a word for historian in the Catawba language, so I use the word for storyteller. I'm glad to be here this morning. So when they brought this slide up, I was like, wow, that's a big picture. I don't know if I can, I'm not going to be able to look at that anymore. So like David said, my research is on Catawba women, primarily from about 1540 to 1840. And within this narrative, I focus on one Catawba woman. Her name was Sally New River, and she was born sometime in the 1740s. But I use her as kind of a lens to see what Catawba women were doing at the time of her life. So the way that I came to Sally was kind of unique, I guess, for outsiders. For me, it's just part of oral history. I was a young child. My grandmother, she lived on the reservation, and she typically sat outside during the summertime making pottery. Well, while she was out there, other women, my aunts, my mom, other women within the family would come and join her. And they would all sit around while she was making pottery under this huge oak tree. And they'd start talking. They'd talk about things from the past. They'd talk about current events, how their week went, who they ran into, maybe at the store, how the children and the grandchildren were doing, who was sick, who was not, and who had died. That was a large part of the conversation. Well, every once in a while, there were these snippets of Sally New River, and it piqued my curiosity. So although a lot of these talks were gossip, especially about their Catawba neighbors, they told wonderful stories about Catawbas from the past. And like I said, I was really captivated by the story of Sally New River. And these days that I spent listening to my relatives, my female relatives especially, that really served as my introduction into Catawba history. And it inspired me to start asking more and more questions about who my people were, where they came from. So I've been fortunate enough that I've been able to work different jobs before going into graduate school that really kind of put me in touch with my history through written documentary evidence, archaeological work. And one of these written documents was a letter written in 1871 that really gives Sally New River life. The letter was written by Thomas D. Spratt, who was a friend of the Catawba Indians. And in this account, he described in detail a council meeting held by the Catawbas, and this occurred sometime around 1800. So adult Catawbas, both men and women, attended the council meeting. But at this particular meeting, Sally wasn't present, and it's not clear why, but this was only temporarily. So our sessions, our council meetings, have a history of sometimes getting extremely heated, very personal. And this is what happened at this particular council meeting. So it's not long after the meeting started that two Catawba women came to blows with one another. So if you can imagine, they're sitting like in a circle, and they probably disagreed on something, or maybe one woman said something nasty about the other woman's family. Anyhow, they came to blows with one another, and there wasn't anyone in the council house that wanted to step in between these two women. Yeah, that speaks power. So someone left the council meeting to find Sally, and Spratt describes Sally's entrance into this meeting. He described it like this: she threw open the door of the room, stepped between the two women. The fighting ended immediately. This is real power. This is real authority, real respect. And as I read this over and over again, I started to get a mental picture of Sally in my head. I imagined that she was somewhere between 45 to 55 years old at this time. And like other Catawba women today, she was short. By short, I mean like here. She was probably no taller than 5 feet. But despite her short stature, her demeanor projected self-confidence and authority. I also imagined her as having dark brown eyes and black hair with a sprinkling of gray. And as I thought about this image more and more, I realized that it was an image of my mother. So I envisioned Sally as a woman that all Catawbas respected, and as indicated by that letter, that she was the matriarch of Catawba people, not just her family lineage, but all Catawba people in her elder years. So I grew more and more curious about Sally's role in Catawba society, which led me to reread James Merle's book, The Indian's New World. And he only mentions Sally briefly, probably because he came against the same walls, stumbling blocks that I did. And that's the scarcity of sources, specifically about Sally. What I did find, and what Merrill introduces in his book, is that Catawba leaders in the 1790s, they decided to deed a large tract of land to the women. But on this deed, they named Sally specifically. And the other Catawba women were identified as other women of the nation. So Sally was really in control of that deed. It was about 500 acres of land, a little bit over, that had previously, up to that point, had belonged to the tribe communally. This parcel of land, today it's known as King's Bottom. And this region included, or this area included, the Catawba towns, the houses, the fields, the burial grounds. And these are places that in Catawba practice had always belonged to women. They lived there, they farmed there, they raised their children there. So even though the land was transferred to Sally, or I should say just because the land was transferred to Sally, this really reinforced the idea that women controlled the land. And as David said, in 2006, I had a great opportunity to volunteer on an archaeological site of Newtown. This would have been this village where Sally lived shortly before her death. While I was there, I got to walk the same footpath that she walked from her house to the river. And I imagined her walking with me. And there were times that I actually felt her near me. Her house had been a log house, had a stone fireplace. It had wooden floors. So it was not the older bark house with the central fire pit. And the way in which Catawba started to use these log houses kind of shows a blending of old with new. So they're adopting some of the Euro-American ways, architecture. Sally also chose to position her house very prudently, right along the edge of the village near the trade path. So Sally knew who was coming, who was going, and, you know, perhaps she had some control over who did come into the village. Artifacts that were found near Sally's house included pearlware, creamware sherds, glassware, coins, cast iron vessel fragments, writing tack hardware. They had horses, or either they allowed their visitors to hitch up the horses nearby. The ammunition was found, jewelry, but there were also fragments of Catawba-made pottery. So again, this is that blending of old with new. And this is what made the world of Catawba women during Sally's lifetime. So the stories, the land deed, the archaeological evidence, of course, left me with even more known about Catawba women's lives from this period. We don't know, or we didn't until my book comes out. We didn't know the kind of prestige that they held in their society. We could assume the kind of prestige they had. We didn't really know the love, the respect that these women held that was bestowed on them. And what I've found is that Catawba women, there were specific Catawba women that were assigned to be the storytellers, the keepers of history. So my work on Sally, it really opened the door to studying the lives of Catawba women in the 17th and 18th centuries. Yes, telling the story is difficult, it's frustrating because, like I said, there are a few primary sources there that really focus on Sally specifically, Catawba women generally. So what I have to do is I have to ask myself, well, these are documents written by either European or Anglo-American men. They're focused on diplomacy, warfare. How do women fit into this narrative? Because they were there. And so it's kind of the cliche of reading between the lines. And I was more, I questioned how they confronted all these changes in their lifetime while holding on to some of the traditional responsibilities, the customs. So that said, Catawba women's absence did not discourage me, which is why I'm here. And instead, the lack of information really made me more determined to tease out details, put them together into a narrative of the lives of Sally and her ancestors. So it's kind of that old saying, tell me I can't do it, and I will. As I learned more and more about Catawba women, I kept returning to some of the same questions. What was the source of Catawba women's prestige? How were women connected to the land? How did women's roles change over time? And why? What changed out of necessity and what did not change? So first I want to really look at the source of Catawba women's prestige. And this is the kind of prestige that admitted them into councils like I just talked about earlier, permitted them a voice, even a belligerent one, in these politics. The Catawbas have an origin story, and it really is important, even though it's, a little bit skewed from a European vantage point. But it does provide Catawbas and historians with a description of this connection between the first Catawba woman and the land. So her spiritual title to the land and the resources that she harvested from the land. At the beginning of the story, first woman, she emerges from a cave. And this is a place that early Catawbas thought linked women to fertility, not just human reproduction, but agricultural productivity as well. So the story goes like this. One day, a scarlet butterfly flying near the mouth of the cave lured first woman out and away from the land she knew. She followed the butterfly to the foot of a huge waterfall where the butterfly had disappeared. Lost and desolate, she fell into a deep sleep. When she awoke, a fierce-looking male spirit stood over her. Dressed in a cloud-like robe, he identified himself as a native of the far-off sky. He spotted her as he flew over, and compassion moved him to visit her, despite a command from the Master of Life against interaction with humans. Afraid to return to the sky after this, he remained on earth, where they lived as husband and wife and had children who became the Catawbas. and lived at the Great Falls of the Catawba River. So that's an edited version. First woman was the mother of all Catawbas. That's how we in Catawba society look at it. And like her, so through first woman, we follow our descent through the female line. So through the mothers, the grandmothers, not through both the male and female line. So say, for example, back in this time period, Catawba would not identify themselves as Catawba based on their father's lineage, because only the mother, for certain, could transfer that Catawba identity. They distinguished themselves as people bound to one another through these matrilineal kinship connections. So the blood relatives would have included a mother, siblings, maternal grandmother, maternal aunt and uncles. Fathers, like the sky god or the sky spirit, they were really important to the life of a child. But one's real relatives were those who were linked, or who linked them to each other and their ancestors through a Catawba woman. And so these type of kinship bonds, kinship networks, were produced through women, which created an 18th century Catawba world and identity. So matrilineal kinship is also important because it connected Catawba women to the land, like I mentioned earlier. Catawba women of a specific lineage owned, or rather controlled, the houses they built and the fields that they farmed. When a woman married, she headed her own household in the same town as her mother, grandmother, and aunts. This is a practice known, as probably you all know, as matrilocality. The household included the mother, her young daughters, any unmarried sons, and perhaps even an orphaned relative or a captive. The husband did live in the wife's house, but he remained allied to his matrilineal relatives, so his relatives through his mother. While Catawbas did hold land collectively, they divided agricultural fields along these matrilineal kinship lines. And so when preparing fields and collecting crops, members of each matriline worked specific sections of the field. Sally and other Catawba women, her ancestors, cultivated, planted, weeded, harvested, and distributed the crops. This is all products of their labor. That's why they had so much control over it. Meanwhile, men spent most of their time away from the towns, hunting during the wintertime or going to war in the summer. So you could think of it like this. The agricultural fields and the homesteads belonged to the women. The forest belonged to the men who hunted for game and engaged with any enemy warriors there. Now, Sally's female ancestors, they practiced a riverine type agriculture. It's large-scale, intensive corn-based farming that took place in the valley of the Catawba River. How do we know this? Well, in the early 1700s, Catawba women had access to a large amount of land, hundreds of acres of fertile land. James Adair, he was a trader, he visited the Catawba towns in 1743, and he noted that the Catawba fields extended uninterrupted for 7 miles. And then along the periphery of this main field were smaller fields of peach orchards and mulberry fields. And of course, the peaches come from Spain. So in these larger fields, Catawba women cultivated a variety of vegetables, fruits, and grains. Everyone here has heard of the Three Sisters. They planted corn, beans, squash, all together in the same mound. Although unaware of the scientific nutritional benefits, Catawbas understood that each of these vegetables was necessary for a balanced diet. And this was especially the case when wildlife was scarce. So corn provided Catawbas with a source of carbohydrates. Beans and squash provided the protein. And each plant helped the other grow. Corn stalks provided beans with a structure on which to climb. Beans fertilized the soil with nitrogen, which is necessary for corn. And the large leaves of the squash plant served as ground cover that facilitated moisture retention. And so this mixing and healing of crops like this, in addition to the three being beneficial to one another, it aided in the maintenance of soil fertility, and it lessened land exhaustion. So at the outskirts of these fields, as I mentioned, women grew and tended orchards of mulberry trees. Now these are fast-growing trees that produce deep purple or black berries. Sometimes they're used for paint, but often these berries are collected as edible food. They're used in teas. The bark of the mulberry tree was pounded until it was a fine, fibrous material that they could use to make clothing. So this is all before the textiles that Europeans bring over. Now, beyond these mulberry fields was the forest, where they gathered wild fruits, nuts, berries, wild greens. But corn is going to remain the primary plant upon which Sally's people depended for nourishment. Her female ancestors and her relatives, they grew 3 different types of corn. One was a yellow, hard grain that's recognized today as that multicolored Indian corn. There was a sweet white, soft kerneled corn, and then there was the short stalk corn that was typically grown in house gardens, so little small gardens near their homes. Today, the Catawba heirloom corn seed is being cultivated and reintroduced back into our agricultural system. So from late August to early November, Catawba women harvested, dried, cooked, and stored food. When preparing dishes, they used specific rules, what we think of today as recipes. They scorched the fresh corn, probably on a flat rock, less likely in a shallow clay pot, because if you put clay next to an intense fire, it's going to crack, even though it's already been burned. And they did this, they scorched the corn to make what Catawbas call supki, a parched corn soup. So it's similar to the Creek corn soup. After parching ears of corn, the women removed and ground the kernels into a very, very fine, soft powder. They place this powder in a large clay cooking pot and enhance the dish with a little salt. Minerals that are a mineral that Sally's ancestors first acquired in trade with other American Indians. Supki was used as a special dish to celebrate the end of harvest season with the green corn ceremony. Young women had to learn to make supki because as they're dating, I'll use modern day terms, as they're dating, it was a responsibility of the young woman to leave her corn soup outside the young man that she was interested in, outside of his door, to prove that she was capable of feeding him, cooking and feeding him. Meanwhile, the man, he had to leave the game that he hunted on her parents' doorstep to prove to them that he was capable of taking care of her. So, but returning to the Green Corn Festival, or ceremony, it was one of the most important ceremonial feasts among southeastern Indians. Catawbas held their feast in late summer. It coincided with the ripening of corn in late July to September. And the ceremony did two things. It was a ritual that worked in terms of giving thanks for a successful corn crop. This ceremony also honored women, again, whom they associated with fertility, because they produced both corn and children. They were the givers of life. So Catawba women worked collectively in harvesting and transporting corn from the field to the village, where they piled these immense amount of corn in the common area or the yard. Over the next 4 days, women and children of each lineage took turns husking ears of corn from early morning till late evening. So this is a feast for a lot of people. Women who were not occupied with the husking spent their days cooking or preparing large quantities of food for the feast. At the end of each day, all Catawbas gathered as a male elder initiated a dance. It's called Kustunk Habarire, the corn silk dance. The dance lasted well after midnight, followed by a celebratory feast that brought together Catawbas from all lineages. And even today, Catawbas talk about seeing their ancestors, the Yesabihina, the ancient ones, dancing across the river. This is near an area where Sally once lived. So while women are staying busy cultivating and gathering culinary plants, they're also gathering wild plants for medicine. They treated their sick family members with natural curatives that aided in things like childbirth or just eased muscular pains. When gathering medicine, Catawba women called on Wantrari, he who never dies. They're asking for effective cures. And they're also conserving these useful plants. So they're either making cuttings and replanting, or they limit the harvest. Because this is herbs, roots that they need for the future. They made a few botanical analgesics that would have included blunt manna grass, red root, fireflower, knotweed, and water root. So a lot of these plants, they steeped in water, and women prepared the teas or the liquids to treat a variety of ailments, from rheumatism to headache. The leaves and stems of the Yopon holly, for example, provided black drink, which occupied a central role in Catawba's spiritual, social, and medicinal rituals. Catawba women considered black drink really useful in terms of easing anxiety, stress, or other mental troubles. Men, on the other hand, they drank large quantities of the tea during ceremonies to induce vomiting for purification purposes before going to war. Catawbas also drank black drink socially, just like we drink coffee or tea today. It's a natural source of caffeine, and it seemed to them to be kind of like the perfect curative. It was good for drinking and good for thinking. Natural remedies like black drink work best under Catawba medicinal practices during a new or full moon. This was regarded as a time of renewal that offered maximum healing powers. So these natural resources during Sally's lifetime, there's going to be less and less available because Catawba land base is shrinking. Not literally, but figuratively, as settlers come in and set up homes on Catawba land. So disease, trade, Indian slavery, and Euro-American settlement will transform Catawba society. But still, many of the fundamental values remain. And these are practices that are carried forward to the next generation, generally by women. So disease and enemy raids hit the Piedmont Indian communities, which our Catawba ancestors, hit these communities hard in the early 1700s. Like I said, these are Sally's ancestors, and they established their towns along the great trading path that connected Virginia fur traders to Indian villages in the Carolina Piedmont. So trade in deer skins and war captives becomes increasingly more important to the lives of many Piedmont Indians. And their populations start to decline. And at the same time, Indian slavery is increasing, furthering or exacerbating this population decline. And what happens is many of these Piedmont Indian groups end up joining or coalescing with the militarily powerful Iswa, what we know today as Catawba. As the fur and slave trade increased, Catawba men gained more power through their economic and political relationships with traders. Although women were pushed into the background, they became the conservators of Catawba customs that focused on kinship and land. All Catawbas, especially women, adapted to these changes that were happening in their world. I mean, they had to in order to survive. At the same time, they remained closely tied to their ancestral land. I'm not saying that they were stationary. They did move around, and they moved around frequently. So by the mid-1700s, Catawbas, or these Piedmont Indians, start to identify, they're transitioning their identity from, say, like people of Nassau, people of Suka, Nusti, Weapi. They're changing their identities that are affiliated with a specific town to the Catawba Nation. Because while the English have been calling them Catawbas and Catawba Nation for a couple of decades by now, Catawbas start to realize that the unification of all of these towns and calling themselves by one name will give them a lot more power diplomatically within the state or the colony. And this is shown, this transition is shown in the 1721 Catawba map, where the headman attempted to show the South Carolina governor that his people at that time still belonged to Nassau town. Well, Nassau was also Esau. And the other towns surrounding Nassau. Indians in these distinct communities, autonomous communities, they spoke a different dialect of Catawba language, but they all spoke a form of Catawba. They shared similar practices and beliefs, but like I said, towns will act independently of one another. And the Esau's are going to, Esau's, Iswa, Esau, spelled Y-S-A-A, Y-S-S-A, these are all the same people. But they're the most powerful group in the Piedmont area. And this is why a lot of these smaller towns end up coalescing, joining with the Catawbas, because their own numbers are declining so quickly. So they each have to reshape their kinship networks. They have to either reshape their traditional knowledge, or it becomes more inclusive with Catawba traditional knowledge. Their subsistence patterns by 1750 it'll be more diversified based on towns. So by the 1750s, like I said, they had all started to identify themselves as belonging to the Catawba Nation rather than people of these formerly independent towns. And they did move their towns from time to time, but they remained on land they recognized as Catawba land. So, for example, after the smallpox epidemic that reduced the Catawba population by half in early 1760, Catawba-speaking people of Nassau, Waiapi, Nusti, Sharau, Weanee, and Suka, all these towns relocated one village further south along the Catawba River near present-day Camden, South Carolina, where they built a single, small, somewhat temporary village. So while living near Camden, this is where Catawba women, the world of Catawba women also makes another shift. They become more directly engaged in the trade economy. White settlement was pretty entrenched in Camden by this time. Camden had become a trade mecca in the backcountry. This is where everybody went to get flour, to get ceramics, anything you needed. And by this time, the Indian slave trade had started to decline. This is also at the same time that deaths from war and disease are decimating native communities. Now, the deerskin trade is going to follow the same trajectory as the slave trade. So there's overhunting and competition with white-owned livestock that starts to reduce the deer population. White settlement is going to increase in the Piedmont region, and as all these newcomers are coming in, their main focus is what? Land. So the market economy changes. Instead of trading with Indians, these new settlers, they're focused on the construction of a plantation system with a commercialized infrastructure. So this focuses less on that plantation economy, but more on women. Like I said, Catawba women move more at the forefront of the economy while they're at Camden. They exchange foods, baskets, pottery, moccasins, all for provisions. And in return, they're getting salt and other goods. They're even getting English-made stoneware. And I like to say that these women are very astute at what's going on in the world around them. So this is right on the cusp of when the British start to increase taxes on British manufactured goods. And these women, Catawba women in Camden, they start to make connections between what the women, the English women in the backcountry are buying, what they need, and so they start to alter the shapes of their pottery to meet market demands. It's not, the foundation of making pottery stays the same. It's just that the shape is altered. Some of them even decorate their pots with sealing wax to kind of resemble English-made dinnerware. So they're very perceptive entrepreneurs who realize that if they replicated the shapes of English ware, they could offer more affordable products. So they start making plates, cups, bowls, pitchers, and very soon they start to travel throughout South Carolina with sacks of pots slung over their shoulders. So wherever they went, they sold and bartered pots and other goods for money and for food. Those were the two things that they needed most. So the Piedmont region is going to experience 3 to 4 waves of white settlers coming into the region. This is in the late 1700s, so post-American Revolution. So you have Scotch-Irish, Scots, German settlers. They're flooding into Catawba territory, building their homes, establishing farms on Catawba land. And these settlers, they viewed Catawba land as unimproved land, mainly because it wasn't full of agricultural fields. And they said, well, this is far more than a small tribe like Catawba could use, so we'll just take it. So this is as Sally is probably about in her 20s. So there's a transition from that 7-mile extended field in 1743 to 1764. A colonial map depicts only one small field near Old Town. And so because this is a small town, it kind of highlights why settlers thought the remainder of Catawba land was just open for the taking. But what they didn't really understand was that Catawbas needed sufficient acreage for hunting, for gathering, to move villages when the land became exhausted. They needed more land for fields, for orchards, but they also needed more land for the clay resources, for building pots upon which their families are increasingly becoming dependent on for their livelihood. So, as the white population increases, Catawba land base shrinks even more. And alternating episodes of drought and flooding destroys their crops at this same time. And so what you have is that Catawbas are living in a persistent state of starvation and poverty. In 1785, the South Carolina governor had convinced the General Assembly to allow, he's going to allow Catawbas to lease out parcels of their land as a means of support, despite Catawba opposition. Now, the state-sanctioned land leasing system, this is what is happening. It starts later that same year. And, of course, it's going to bring more whites into Catawba territory. Now, Sally and other Catawbas, male and female alike, they start to recognize, or they have recognized, the threat to settler encroachment to their villages, their homes, their fields. So in 1796, Catawba leaders deeded the remainder of the commonly held Catawba tribal land, approximately 500 acres on the east side of the Catawba River, to Sally New River and other women of the nation. The land deed. This land deed is significant for two reasons. First, by legally deeding the remainder of their land to the women, Catawba leaders realized that white settlement and the leasing system posed a real threat to Catawba land and their survival as a people. Second, in transferring this land to Catawba women, the deed recognized that women owned the land, the villages, the houses, the fields. That is, they're using the American legal system to protect a founding principle of Catawba culture. Now, as for the rest of the land beyond these 500 acres, Catawbas continued leasing to white tenants in order to survive. And a lot of these parcels of land went up to 3,000 acres with an annual payment of anywhere between $1 to $10. Now, there were two land plat books kept, or rent books. The first one started in 1763 and went up to about 1800. And this was kept by Indian agent Charles Miller. But according to rumor, his wife destroyed this book when he died. The second book includes on the front part of the book, it includes a notation that says, quote, "Old book," unquote, to Scribner's and Sons publishers in New York for rebinding in 1900. Now, the location, the survival of the first lease book is unclear. But the second lease book was kept by Hugh White. He was also an agent to the Indians, and he kept it from 1810 to around 1829. And this lease book is really important, not only because it shows an equal number of Catawba women and men leasing large tracts of land to white settlers, but it also shows this matriline. It shows the family structure, because the Catawbas who are leasing these lands, their names are listed. There's several wills in the back of these books, or in the back of this book. But to be clear, these are not land sales. These are only leases, usage of land. So the transactions, they do show that Catawbas received most of their payments in cash. Other items offered in payment of rent included corn, wheat, beef, sugar, coffee. And there were non-consumable goods as well, like horses, shoes, satisfaction of store credit, and cloth. Now, the lease book is really important to historians because it does illustrate how Catawbas adapted to that plantation economy in order to survive. But adaptation didn't mean the loss of women's traditional roles in Catawba society. Change did not equate loss. In addition to recognizing the profound connection between women and the land, the lease book hints, like I said, at the continuation of a matrilineal kinship. Sally New River, she held far more leases than other Catawba women, and she only owned one less than the chief at the time. So she's collecting more in cash, more in goods than other Catawbas did. So this lease book, it suggests that Sally is retaining her sense of responsibility to her people because she does go around collecting rent for her other family members. She's also collecting rent for orphaned Indian children. And she's not keeping the money for herself. She takes it back to, say, somebody who couldn't make the walk of 10 miles for the day. By late 1821, though, Sally has passed away. Her name's no longer listed as a landlord or a recipient of lease payments after September 1821. So you might be asking yourself, okay, well, what happened to the land deed after she passed away? Well, several years after Sally's death, her male relative, Jamie Kegg, leased the land to a white man. He leased the land. He didn't own the land. The white man didn't own the land. He's leasing it. That white man, in turn, in 1824, sold the lease to another white man. So by this time, it's out of the hands of Catawbas. And then in 1840, Catawbas relinquished their territory to the state of South Carolina in the Nation Board Treaty. So this ends the land leasing system and the reservation. And I could go further into detail about this, but I'll hold it there. The story of Sally New River and her female ancestors and relatives exemplifies the importance of land to Catawbas and tells us how they associated women's prestige to the land through the origin story, their kinship system, and subsistence practices. Depopulation, trade, and white settlement dramatically changed Catawba women's roles, but they remained distinctly Catawba because of some of the traditional roles and responsibilities they held on to. Land continues to be central to Catawba identity, as is kinship. And just as all Catawbas are linked by descent from first woman, they also are connected spiritually as well as physically to the great falls of the Catawba River where first woman gave birth to them. Hawa. Thank you.
Are there any questions? I have one. What's the source of Sally New River's authority and prestige? What kind of evidence, either from oral history or the documentary record, where do you see her position coming from?
Right. So I didn't go into great detail on that with this paper, but Sally was the daughter or granddaughter of King Hagler, and he was the most famous or most well-known diplomat of the Catawbas. In the 1750s, he went up into a North Carolina court, pulling an old cow behind him and taking it up in front of the judge and saying, "The agent cheated us out of this. We can't eat this. What are you going to do about it? Because I'm leaving this cow here." He's also most well known for giving what some say is the first prohibition speech. Again, he's in North Carolina, and he told the judge and the governor at that time, he said, "You know, your people keep coming down, settling on our land, and giving my men your alcohol. I can't be responsible for what happens to them once they have this drink. So I want you to quit sending this alcohol down into my land, down among my people." And Hagler also recognized the power of, or the prestige of women when he stated to the North Carolina Assembly. He said, "We care about our women. We need our women." And he was really perplexed when all the men in the North Carolina Assembly just kind of snickered, because what they didn't understand was that matrilineage that's connected to survival. So Sally was the granddaughter of Hagler. Her mother is unnamed. We don't know her mother's name or who she was, but she married a colonial trader. His name was Matthew Toole. Married in the sense of the country, the land of the Indians, not through the church. And so Sally is half Catawba. She goes away after the 1760 smallpox epidemic. She goes away to live with the Spratt family, who I mentioned at the beginning of this paper. She lives with them until she's somewhere around the age of 18. Then she returns to the Catawbas. Now, there's this elaborate fictionalized story that says she returned on horseback with her maidens walking beside her. That speaks Disney to me. So after she's back among her people, she marries General New River. Now, the assumption is, the evidence is not clear, that he was a Scot until the American Revolution, when he had a very successful battle against northern Indians along the New River. And so he took that name, New River, and he would never go back to his old name, so it's kind of lost in history, whether he was a Scot or not. So she's married to General New River, and that's the source. Her family connections and her marriage are the source of her prestige. So she's different in that way from other Catawba women. Socially, or like meeting face to face, she's not different from the other women. She does the same things that other Catawba women are doing. But they do recognize her as coming from this very distinct family. So that's some of what I get through the written record. Also, that white neighbors who lived around the reservation, they knew of Sally, and they respected her. And she had a wicked sense of humor. I mean, seriously wicked. So there's one story, and it's about sometime around 1800, and it's during the wintertime. And this Irishman has just landed and come into the back country. He's very unfamiliar with the landscape, but he's deathly afraid of snakes. And so some of the local townspeople, probably in Camden, Waxhaw, they send him to the reservation or to the nation. And he talks with Sally. And she sits there listening to him, when he asks, well, what do I do about keeping snakes away? Now, mind you, this is in the middle of wintertime, in the middle of a blizzard. She looks at him, she says, well, if you go out there and you cut a long tree limb, and you carry that around with you and just tap it in front of you, everywhere you go, you'll be safe because it'll scare the snakes away. Not once did this Irishman think about the snow laying on the ground or the cold temperature. And as he walked away, all the Catawbas started laughing. So they had a good joke on him. Yeah.
Well, it's for the online folks too.
I was wondering if you could kind of speak to maybe the reasoning why a male Catawba was able to lease the land out after she died. Was it due perhaps to who she was and the story that you just told about her? Or were there other cultural changes that were taking place? Because I guess other Catawba women were named on the deed originally.
Right. But, okay, here's the problem with that. Those women, their names were not listed on that deed anywhere. So it would be very difficult under South Carolina law at that time for them to come forward and say, oh, well, I'm included on this deed. I have a right to this land. Simply because they didn't include the names. The reason why Jamie Kegg got it is he was her closest living survivor or relative. And by 1840, Jamie Kegg had pretty much given up on the Catawba Nation. And he will be the one that leads, I guess, is in front of everything in terms of signing the Treaty of Nations Ford. After the treaty, he takes over half of the Catawbas to live with the Cherokee. So Jamie is on, a lot of it comes from kinship connections. He was her nephew. So the land, he was our only living relative, so the land would have gone to him because basically the other women weren't named and you couldn't determine who that land would go to after her death. And the reason why this land was put in Sally's name in the first place is because the men were leasing all the land. And if they deeded this land to Sally, there was no way that anybody could touch that land until after her death. Does that kind of help to clarify?
South Carolina law, the way that set it up, where it had to go here, that it ended up with male instead of the intention of the matrilineal, and keeping it with the women to keep it safe.
It's very complex. Yeah, it's not necessarily that it went to the male relative. He just happened to be alive.
Any other questions? Well, let's give Brooke a big hand for speaking with us today. Please join us next month, September 19th, for Sarah Lowry from New South Associates. She'll be speaking about archaeogeophysics and Mississippian town sites on the Tennessee River Valley. Thank you very much. Have a good day.